Anybody for some Danish pastries? Well, listen to today's episode and you'll find that King Aethelred had more than his fair share. (865) was a pretty significant one, not only for Wessex but for pretty much the whole of England, in that it was the year that the Great Heathen Army arrived on English shores, invading East Anglia. The Great Heathen Army was different from its predecessor armies that had occasionally tried to invade England, in that it wanted to actually conquer and to settle the English landmass, in addition to the usual Viking pillaging and raping practices. It was led by the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, who was a semi-legendary figure, but his sons definitely existed, and these included Bjorn Halfdan, Ivar the Boneless, who was called the Boneless on account of possibly being quite snake-like in appearance, or indeed in that he was treacherous, or that he had bone disease, or was indeed impotent, but we don't quite know. It's a cool name anyhow, I think, and indeed a guy called Ubba. At least in its first stages, those were the leaders, quite a formidable force. So when they arrived in East Anglia's king, who was Anglo-Saxon at the time, King Edmund, bought them off, which was the traditional Anglo-Saxon practice towards Viking invaders. And the army used this money to invade and annex the kingdom of Northumbria, whose king, Aethelred II, had actually killed Ragnar Lodbrok a couple of years before. So it was a sweet sort of revenge for his sons to, kill Ella in the way they did. Next, the Great Heathen Army went to Mercia, and Burgred, who was the king of Mercia, had to buy them off because they started lodging at Nottingham. I say lodging, they occupied the town of Nottingham, and Aethelred, who had become king of Wessex in 865, had accompanied Burgred to try and dislodge the Great Heathen Army from Nottingham, but they failed, so Burgred had to buy them off. And after biding some time, kind of reconstructing the kingdom of Northumbria in a sort of more Danish image, obviously they had a new regime to exact there, they used the wealth that they had to incapacitate and decapacitate King Edmund in East Anglia, and it was I feel quite sorry for Edmund. Edmund did become a saint afterwards, I suppose, but yeah, he thought that the Danes were his friends, which perhaps was a little bit naive. So by about 870, this is where it sort of becomes more centred upon Wessex. The Great Heathen Army decides to invade it. Aethelred, with the help of his younger brother Alfred, who I'm obviously very excited to talk about in the next episode, they tried really hard to counteract the invasion of the Great Heathen Army. And they did actually have a fair share of victories. So they won at Englefield near Reading, and Ashdown again, which is near Reading. But they also suffered some bad defeats at Reading itself, because the first thing the Danes did when they invaded was to occupy Reading itself in December 870. But then later on, the next year in 871, they lost at Basing in Hampshire, and Meryton, where we don't quite know where it is. And the Anglo-Saxons, didn't really have the best time there. And it was potentially after the Battle of Meryton in April 871 that Aethelred died, possibly of wounds sustained in that battle, or just stress-induced generally from the fact that his country was experiencing a huge wholesale invasion from a massive army that had already taken out two kingdoms, if not the third, in the form of Mercia, where it's, there isn't really any indication that Mercia was particularly strong in this time, and that the Danes basically could take advantage there. So Wessex was, as the television show on Netflix indicates, was the last kingdom by this point, I think. So that's probably fair enough that if he did die of stress, you can probably understand why. Aside from these quite large tribulations, Aethelred perhaps inadvertently pursued a form of monetary union with Mercia by issuing the same coinage and using the same mints, which perhaps brought a step closer to a form of England, because obviously I think if you're going to define what a country is, you would probably think, well, it's got to have maybe perhaps its own currency, or a step closer to that. So that's one other important thing that Aethelred did, but really his reign is sort of marked by his encounters and eventual demise at the hands of the great heathen army. I think if you're going to evaluate him, then you'd probably... I mean, the monetary unity thing, of course, is very important, as I just suggested, but he did show that the great heathen army wasn't invincible, which is what you might think, because you might be quite terrified by, basically a huge bunch of warriors rocking up at your kingdom. And yeah, so showing that they could be supported was probably a very, very important thing on the part of Aethelred, and it was great tutelage for Alfred, as we'll find out in the next episode. So I hope you enjoyed this. As you saw, Aethelred got his fair share of Danish pastries. So thank you very much, and I'll see you for the next episode with King Alfred the Great.